I'm not surprised that Black women created the concept of reproductive justice because we've been thinking about this for 400 years. When we were kidnapped from Africa and brought here to breed as a wealth building strategy for capitalism, then our children were prized until the end of the Civil War. That same womb product that was so treasured during slavery became problematized and criminalized after slavery. We've been fighting for bodily autonomy and fertility control, despite the narratives that are out there distorting that history.
That is an excerpt from an interview with 2022 MacArthur Fellow Loretta J. Ross, who is a reproductive justice and human rights activist, reframing reproductive rights within a broader context of human rights. Over her decades of grassroots organizing and national strategic leadership, Ross has centered the voices and well-being of women of color. In our new series, Fellow Spotlight, we go in depth with some of our MacArthur Fellows to learn more about them, their work, and their exceptional creativity. Let's hear more from Loretta Ross's interview. Please note, this interview discusses sexual violence.
I'd been introduced to the human rights framework at the same time I was conceptualizing with 11 other women what reproductive justice was. It was a coincidence that ended up being a well-met marriage. In 1994, I was working with Reverend C.T. Vivian at the Center for Democratic Renewal National Anti-Klan Network. And I got asked a very important question by this white supremacist that I was deprogramming named Floyd Cochran. He'd been the national spokesman for the Aryan Nations. And so Floyd asked me, after he defected from the Aryan Nations, where's the work he could do? And I said, well, you can join the civil rights movement. And Floyd, kind of like looked at me skeptically and said, you think they're ready for an ex-Nazi? And I said, maybe you're right about that. Let me check. So I took Floyd's question to Reverend Vivian, who'd been the aide to Dr. Martin Luther King. And Reverend Vivian shocked me by saying, well, Martin never meant to build a civil rights movement. He meant to build a human rights movement. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And so he went to his library shelf and pulled out a copy of Dr. King's last Sunday sermon, March 31st, 1968.
There can be no gainsaying of the fact that a great revolution has taken place in the world today.
Dr. King said that we were in the middle of a triple revolution, a revolution in weaponry with our ability to destroy the earth, a revolution in communication with our ability to talk instantaneously around the world. He said, but the most important revolution is the human rights revolution, the freedom struggle that's taking place around the world.
All over the world.
And I read from that, and so did Reverend Vivian, that our job was to build a human rights movement in this country. For the last 50 years, I've been working on human rights, white supremacy, reproductive justice, and women's rights. But I started out as a teen mother. I became pregnant at age 14 through incest. And because I had no control over if and when I had sex, and in the 1960s, I didn't even have control over if and when I'd have the baby. So the only choice I had was whether to keep my son or give him up for adoption. And by choosing to keep my son, then I went from being a scared pregnant teenager to a teen mom. And that changed the rest of my life. I became dedicated to ensuring that other poor Black girls didn't have sex forced upon them and could control their bodies when sex was forced upon them. And so that's when I became involved in both reproductive politics, but particularly sterilization abuse, because I was sterilized also in 1973. And then I learned about abortion rights because I had also had an abortion at 16. And then I helped co-develop the concept of reproductive justice in 1994. Abortion rights was always isolated from the social justice issues that were prevalent in a pregnant person's life long before they were pregnant. If they had housing insecurity or fear of losing their jobs or fear of violence in their lives, that would determine whether they would keep an unplanned pregnancy or not. So when you start with the pregnancy, you're starting at the wrong place. You have to start with what's going on in the person's life before they're pregnant. And so by us splicing together social justice and reproductive rights, we arrived at a human rights-based framework that we called reproductive justice. And it was created by 12 Black women, of which I was one. Now, in short, reproductive justice has 4 tenets. Every human being has the right to not have a child and use birth control or abortion or abstinence if that works for them. But also, we have to fight for the right to have the children that we want to have, and that's the second tenet of reproductive justice. And it spawned a whole movement called birth justice, which is to control the conditions under which we have children, using midwives or doulas, or having our pregnancy plans respected when we go to hospitals, or avoiding an unnecessary cesarean section if it's not medically required. And the third tenet is probably the most expansive and the most inclusive, because once the baby is born, we fight for the right to raise our children in safe and healthy environments. So this brings us into conversation with gun violence and safe schools and environmental problems and tax policies and all of these issues that are non-biological, that don't look like they should affect reproductive politics, but they do. In 2004, the LGBT movement offered a critique of the reproductive justice framework because they thought it was too focused on the womb. And so they added a 4th principle talking about bodily autonomy, gender identity, and sexual pleasure. The reproductive justice framework goes far beyond the pro-choice, pro-life binary, just focusing on abortion. It talks about the full range of things that are happening in people's lives. And because it's based on the 8 categories of human rights, it includes everybody. Quite often, we as human rights activists are forced to work in boxes and on issues and programs and platforms. And I'm like, we have to change how people think, not just what they think about. I think that's what's so important. If you change the framework through which people think, they'll think differently about the things that matter. I'm really invested in people seeing their entire world through the human rights framework. Because it doesn't matter what economic or social system you live under. The bottom line question is, does it protect human rights or does it violate them? Because if it protects your human rights, that's the system you need to work to build. If it violates your human rights, that's the system you work to deconstruct.
Loretta Ross is an associate professor of the study of women and gender at Smith College. She was the national coordinator for Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective. Ross is the co-author of Undivided Rights, Women of Color Organizing for Reproductive Justice, the co-editor of Radical Reproductive Justice, Foundations, Theory, Practice, and Critique. And she has a forthcoming book, Calling In. The MacArthur Fellows program identifies and supports extraordinarily creative individuals with a track record of excellence, who demonstrate the ability to impact society in significant and beneficial ways through their pioneering work. To learn more, visit us at macfound.org.